Okay, so I picked this comic here, Fantastic Four, from 1977, when I was the ripe old age of 9, because this was all about science fiction, and this was all about color, obviously, as well. Back in the day when we used to have black and white televisions. And this was, the world's greatest comic magazine. What's not to like about it? And the idea of this as well is that this was a team of people, one of whom was a scientist, Reed Richards, Mr. Fantastic. And this particular comic is where Reed Richards is obsessed or taken over by the Molecule Man, and he's transforming his environment around him to various evil means. And so, in some ways, I thought this kind of was interesting because it encapsulated my childhood. I used to love American comics because of the idea of, the US, America, the wonderful, colourful world that everything happened out there.
So you weren't living in the US at the time then?
No, so I was living in Ballina, County Mayo, but I was born in England, and in the Midlands of England, in Derby. We used to be able to get comics in England really easily, but in Ireland they used to kind of suddenly appear, and so you'd buy them in the newsagents. And so they were so precious, like I kept it, even though I read it over and over again.
It doesn't look like you read it over and over again, it's really...
I'd be very carefully taking it and looking at it.
So it must have been like really exciting when you'd go into the newsagent and find...
Oh yeah, that was like, wow, to get new comics in there, it was absolutely amazing. And I just loved the fact that this was, and I liked science. And this was sort of about, maybe it's kind of like in some weird way like a role model. This is somebody who's a scientist, who's doing these wonderful, fantastic things in, New York. But I think I picked this one because, the title of the comic is about the Molecule Man, and unbeknown to me when I was a boy, I suppose that's what I've become. It's like a molecule man. What I'm interested in is how, it's that kind of interface of how does molecules and the chemical elements of life all kind of build up together into something that's alive, and where does the differentiation start? How do you...
Where does it stop being a molecule and start being a part of a something?
And being a something, yeah.
Yeah, exactly.
So that's what I love about genetics and DNA, which is the other thing here. Yeah, this thing here. So this is DNA. And I remember one of the first things I did in a lab when I was an undergrad was purified DNA. And again, from having read about it in the comics and stuff, to actually see it, like that is DNA.
That's
that is
incredible to me.
deoxyribonucleic acid. This is the molecule of life. This is where it all comes from. And it just looks like thread.
It looks like pieces of thread that I took out of my weaving basket and put in a Petri dish and pretended it was DNA.
Exactly, yeah. It looks like a piece of cotton.
Yeah. So each of these little strands is probably made up of many strands.
Millions of molecules of DNA. And to think that that's, in there is the kind of software for life, the code of life is plugged in there.
It's incredible. It's incredible that you can actually see the physical DNA. I find that unbelievable.
It really is, yeah. I think it still amazes me every time we do that simple experiment of, precipitating DNA. You go, wow, this is it.
Yeah.
And to think that, and I suppose that's the other thing, in the 1970s when this comic was published actually, the techniques were just starting to become available to actually modify bacteria genetically, so to change the DNA that they had, both in a way to try to understand how do those bacteria work, but also in ways to try to figure out, can we make them more useful? Can we use them to generate important molecules for medicine, like insulin and the like? So to think that, this seemingly tangled mess of white threads contains the information to build life is I think it's incredible.
It is incredible. Do you want to just introduce yourself there? Who is it?
So I'm Stephen Gordon, and as my different items here show, I'm a scientist. I'm interested in using, I suppose, these molecular methods to try to understand how do bacteria work, and the particular bacteria that I work on cause an infectious disease called tuberculosis. And so I'm basically using the techniques of exploring molecules and understanding how they work into understanding how is it that a bacteria, something that you can't even see, so invisible, when it infects us, can make us so sick that some people die from it. And so even though, again, tuberculosis, the thing that always strikes me is when I talk about tuberculosis, particularly to people at home, is that that's like an old disease that doesn't exist anymore. And the reality is that before COVID, as a single infectious agent, tuberculosis was the single most deadly infectious disease. So somebody still dies of tuberculosis every 20 seconds. That's 1.5 million people dying of a disease that we think is solved. Eradicated.
It's incredible.
And
how many people did you say?
1.5, well, even more, 1.7 million people. 1.7 million people will die of tuberculosis this year. It's got worse with COVID. And there are 10 million new cases every year. And when you look at the world, where do we find those infections and deaths? It's largely in low and middle income countries. So this is where as well we see the interaction of infectious disease with society. Mm-hmm. If you live in a country that has worse living standards, if you're poor and you get infected, you're more likely to succumb to that infection because you just can't be detected and then you can't be treated. Mm. So poverty is what really drives TB. It's always been the case. Overcrowding, malnutrition, stress, that's what allowed TB to really take a real hold of the human population. Mm. And so what we try to do is to try to explore that bacteria. How does it cause disease? How does it make us sick? And by doing that, can we develop new ways to stop it, either infecting us or to treat it when we do get infected?
It must be a difficult thing to do because you're still trying to do it. Yeah. And you're not a very bad scientist who just isn't good at their job.
I think you're right. I think I think the issue as well though with TB has been that in the 1950s, of course, it would have been a major area of research. People would have been researching it. The reality happens that when diseases don't become a problem for high-income countries, research funding kind of dries away. If we think of what happened again with COVID, we went from identifying an infectious agent to developing incredibly efficacious and powerful vaccines, in the space of a year. But that cost billions of dollars and was based on a huge body of science that had been learned about viruses and vaccines and how best to interact with the immune system for a long time. If you're working on a disease that infects, low and middle income countries, the poorest people in society, that impetus to invest in research, invest in the development of new drugs, just isn't there.
Sort of demoralizing slightly.
It is, but I suppose it's, it's that thing of what makes you wake up in the morning. What is it that makes you want to come into work? And it's that idea that something that you find in the lab, by looking at that DNA or by exploring the bacteria, maybe the little eureka moment that then in years to come brings about better treatment.
So when you talk about doing that, about being a molecule man who is looking at this particular bacteria, when I went over to your lab there to look at what goes on, largely, we didn't go into the level 2 sort of very protected lab that you work in, but these items here all look very ubiquitous. They're little tubes of colourless, transparent liquid that look for all the world like water. In fact, some of them are even labelled water, RNAs, free water. So it's amazing that with these sort of simple little tubes full of transparent water, transparent looking liquid, you're able to actually, you're actually looking at bacteria and doing your research. It's amazing.
Yeah, I suppose it's true that sometimes maybe all the time, a lot of what we do in the lab is, putting colourless liquids into plastic tubes. But I suppose that's why I love microbiology, because with microbiology, you see the outcome of it. So you grow the bacteria on, for example, like an agar plate that we have there as well. So here is, a typical technology like the agar plate. When we think about it, it's developed in the late 1800s. It's basically jelly with some nutrients in it that let the bacteria grow. And so that's, okay, this is in plastic, but that basic technology, you could argue, hasn't changed much in the last century, more. So it's by marrying up those two things, the molecular genetic side of things with getting bacteria to grow on agar plates, allows you to then actually see what you're doing, to see. So for example, with this little piece of apparatus here, this is an electroporator. This allows us basically to modify the DNA that's in a bacteria by basically putting a large electrical charge across this. I can basically force new DNA into a bacteria that wouldn't have it usually. And then I can take those bacteria and grow them on agar plates. And then by studying those bacteria on the agar plates, I can start to understand, what does that new piece of DNA do? Or what does the fact if I switch off a gene, what effect does that have then on the bacteria? And how does that help us understand how that bacteria infects us and can cause disease?
Amazing. So through these kind of iterative processes of doing these same things over and over again, you're actually learning more and more in the hopes of being able to help. I just have this here quickly just to sort of bring it full circle about how I think TB, what you're studying, there probably isn't a family in Ireland that haven't been affected by it, that somebody in the family historically had it. And ironically, I was preparing for this a few days ago, and a friend of mine happened to send me photographs on her phone of these items here. And this is an envelope with a letter in it that was sent by her mother to her husband to the TB unit in Waterford Hospital. And here's a photograph of her as an infant. My friend is the baby there being christened by, there isn't a single member of her family in this photograph. Her father was in the hospital suffering from TB in the sanatorium. Her mother was still in hospital because back in the day when you had a baby you didn't come out straight away, and children were christened immediately. And I think her father didn't get to meet her. She was over a year old by the time he actually met her for the first time, because he was sequestered away in the hospital suffering from TB. So it is amazing how I think it does touch everybody in Ireland in some way, and hopefully, Steve, you'll keep plugging away at it and you might be the molecule man who actually solves it with any luck at all.
Fingers crossed.
Yeah.
Fingers crossed.
Thanks a million.
No, pleasure.